Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, Qualcomm and ARM have a major falling out. Also, more devices have been blocked from upgrading to Windows 11 24H2. And, unfortunately, more bad news for CrowdStrike as they fall back under the microscope once again. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And also brought to you by Master Packager, who make an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. Microsoft has added Asus X415KA and X515KA laptop models to the block list for Windows 11 24H2 after confirming reports of incomplete upgrades followed by crashing and the dreaded blue screen of death experienced by users. Microsoft suggests that users of impacted Asus computer models refrain from attempting to manually update to version 24H2, be it through the Windows 11 installation assistant or using a media creation tool, and they have stated they are working with Asus on a permanent resolution. So, unfortunately, if you're on those laptops, don't upgrade and just keep an eye out for a permanent solution to this. According to The Verge, Windows 11 version 24H2 includes new ways to update the OS that makes it more efficient and speedier, including parallel processing of components, scalable use of system RAM, and an optimized cache to update components. These changes mean Windows 11 version 24H2 can install monthly updates up to 45% faster, with up to 25% less CPU usage. This also makes the restart time nearly 40% faster on some systems. Microsoft tested the latest 24H2 servicing updates on a virtual machine against its older 22H2 version of Windows 11, but the performance claims also apply against 23H2 as they both use the same older servicing stack. Microsoft has also improved the download sizes of feature updates to Windows 11, reducing them by around 200 megabytes. So a welcome improvement of speedier updates, because I'd noticed since about Server 2016 that updates have become slower. Now, they were improved with Server 2019 and on the operating systems for the desktop, but they had been noticeably slower compared to earlier operating systems. So this is a welcome improvement, in my opinion. According to a report by BleepyComputer.com, the SEC in the US has charged 4 companies, Unisys Corp., Avaya Holdings, Checkpoint Software, and Mimecast for allegedly misleading investors about the impact of their breaches during the massive 2020 Solarwinds Orion hack. The charges come due to a range of matters of downplaying the seriousness of the breach. For example, Avaya Holdings claimed their breach only involved a limited number of email accounts, whereas they reportedly knew 145 files in their cloud storage environment were accessed to. Unisys reportedly addressed its breach as though it was a hypothetical scenario, not as though it had actually happened. These companies have agreed to pay civil penalties to settle the SEC's charges. Unisys will pay $4 million, Avaya Holding will pay $1 million, Checkpoint will pay $995,000, and Mimecast will pay a $990,000 penalty. So, it pays to just be honest and open when these things happen to your organizations. Google has announced there will be a preview later this year of an enterprise feature that will enable organizations to provide their own curated extension store to enable employees to go in and install only extensions that have been pre-approved by their IT. Screenshots of the feature indicates organizations will also be able to apply their own custom branding. Google has also announced some other upcoming features, including some DRM capabilities, like being able to control copy and paste, for example, and Chrome version rollbacks will be possible that persist user files. So you'll be able to roll back versions if needed in a snap without having to worry about losing some of the user data. The Irish data watchdog DPC found that LinkedIn failed to meet the standards for obtaining valid consent, did not rely on legitimate interests, or demonstrate contractual necessity in its use of personal data for advertising, according to a report by bleepycomputer.com. The violations specifically are Article 61A, LinkedIn failed to obtain valid consent for third-party data, 61F, LinkedIn's use of legitimate interests as a legal basis was overridden by users' rights. 61B, LinkedIn's claim that data processing was contractually necessary was invalid. 131C and 141C, LinkedIn failed to provide sufficient information about its processing activities. And 51A, LinkedIn violated the principle of fairness by processing data in ways users did not fully understand. The original complaint came from a French nonprofit organization, and the DPC has hit LinkedIn with a €310 million fine and instructed that the practices must change going forward. Pwn to Own Ireland was held last week, with $1 million in prizes awarded for over 70 unique zero-day vulnerabilities exploited in fully patched devices during the event. Some of the devices hacked during the event belong to vendors like Lexmark, Samsung, Synology, and more. Rather than go through in detail, because there is a lot of detail, bleepycomputer.com actually had multiple blog posts covering each day of the event and a lot of specifics around the different devices that were hacked, the vulnerabilities leveraged, and more details on the exploits. So if you'd like to actually check that out for yourself, I'll share a link to that article with this episode, and you'll find that at 5bytespodcast.com with this episode, which is episode 358. The researcher who uncovered the recently disclosed Downdate attack method, which could be used to downgrade Windows to previous versions of the operating systems that are susceptible to many previously disclosed vulnerabilities, as they had not been updated to a decent patch level to protect against those vulnerabilities, has published new research detailing an exploit using a Windows update process to bypass DSE protections by downgrading a patched component, even on fully patched Windows 11 systems. Now, this is something that was alluded to in the original research of using this Downdate type attack method, but now he's actually gone and published an exploit, which is interesting because this is a method that Microsoft at the time had somewhat dismissed. So it'll be interesting to see if this new published exploit, if this actually gets picked up and used by cyber gangs, if Microsoft's going to have to walk back that statement and take some sort of decisive action on preventing this in future. The particular exploit details an attack which is possible by replacing the ci.dll file that's responsible for enforcing DSE with an unpatched version that ignores driver signatures, which essentially sidesteps Windows protective checks. This replacement is triggered by the Windows update, exploiting a double read condition where the vulnerable ci.dll copy is loaded into memory right after Windows starts checking the latest copy of ci.dll. This race window, as it's called, allows the vulnerable ci.dll to load while Windows thinks it has verified the file, hence allowing the unsigned drivers to be loaded into the kernel. In a published video, the researcher demonstrates how he reverted the DSE patch via a downgrade attack and then exploited the component on a fully patched Windows 11 23H2 machine. The researcher's work shows that downgrade attacks are still possible via several pathways, even if they sometimes carry strong privilege prerequisites. The researcher highlights the need for endpoint security tools to closely monitor downgrade procedures, even those that do not cross critical security boundaries. So certainly very interesting development on this story that I covered on previous episodes of the podcast. Qualcomm has reportedly been put on notice by ARM that it's going to have its license revoked, meaning it wouldn't be able to make its own chips based on the ARM architecture anymore. The reported move follows a raft of speculation that Qualcomm has been looking to buy Intel, which obviously makes CPUs based on the more complex, traditional x86 architecture. According to Bloomberg, the cancellation relates to a dispute, though, over the royalties Qualcomm pays ARM in return for licensing its architecture, and a Qualcomm spokesperson has reportedly returned fire when asked for comment, saying that ARM's, quote, claim for termination is completely baseless, end quote. The spokesperson is quoted as saying that the license cancellation represented more unfounded threats designed to strong-arm a longtime partner, interfere with their performance-leading CPUs, and increase royalty rates regardless of the broad rights under their architecture license. The spokesperson is also quoted as describing ARM's behavior as anti-competitive conduct, describing a desperate ploy while saying that the company is confident that Qualcomm's rights under its agreement with ARM will be affirmed. According to the quoted Qualcomm spokesperson, the action relates to an upcoming trial in December, and ARM is making an attempt to disrupt the legal process. So it's interesting, there's going to be a case in December, and I wonder, are they going to involve some of the regulators, perhaps the European Commission or the US counterpart too, because it seems like they've definitely been getting more involved in regulations against tech companies and trying to control these anti-competitive practices. Now, I don't know if they'll have much of a claim if they really do go ahead and buy Intel, but I mean, at least according to this article, the dispute is not over Qualcomm buying Intel and then becoming somewhat competitive against ARM. So it seems, at least in the immediate case, they may have something working in their favor to win this anti-competitive suit. The long-anticipated Delta lawsuit against CrowdStrike was filed in Fulton County Superior Court in Georgia, where they called the faulty software update from CrowdStrike catastrophic and said the firm forced untested and faulty updates to its customers, causing more than 8.5 million Microsoft Windows-based computers around the world to crash. CNN reported that the July 19th incident, which obviously led to worldwide flight cancellations and hit industries around the globe, including banks, healthcare, media companies, and hotel chains, in particular, devastated Delta for longer than other airlines, which is also a claim that is being used against them by CrowdStrike in the case. Delta, which said it has purchased CrowdStrike's products since 2022, said the outage forced it to cancel 7,000 flights, impacting 1.3 million passengers over the course of 5 days. Delta also said CrowdStrike is liable for over $500 million in out-of-pocket losses, as well as for an unspecified amount of lost profits, expenditures, including attorney's fees and reputational harm and future revenue loss. CrowdStrike has questioned why Delta fared so much worse than other airlines and said it has minimal liability, something that Delta is obviously rejecting, and thus why they're bringing the case. So this is obviously something that was hashed out in the media in the height of the actual problems that Delta was experiencing, with Delta Airlines CEO making some wild claims, some that were quite frankly laughable too, just in general, against Microsoft as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how this case unfolds. Even though the CEO said some pretty daft things in the media, in my opinion, I think they still have a pretty strong case against CrowdStrike, but it's going to be interesting to see how this case finishes out. In another potentially bad news story for CrowdStrike, there was a bizarre story recently about a deal worth $32 million where a firm called Carasoft, who works with US government agencies, appeared to be reselling CrowdStrike to the IRS. But the thing is, it turned out there was no finalized deal with the IRS and they did not make the purchase. But the middleman firm Carasoft has been making on-time payments for the $32 million to CrowdStrike regardless of the fact there was no actual end deal with the IRS. When asked for comment by Bloomberg News, both companies explained that they had a non-cancelable order between them. They declined to say why that deal was struck without a purchase in place from the IRS, and shares of CrowdStrike fell as much as 2.7% after Bloomberg News reported about the deal. Some legal and accounting experts who review the arrangement at Bloomberg's request said it raises red flags that merit scrutiny from regulators. The deal also raised concerns within CrowdStrike, according to people familiar with the matter in the company itself, and many specifics of the transaction remain unclear. Depending on how CrowdStrike accounted for the deal in financial statements, the company didn't explain those details, it was big enough that it could have made the difference between the company beating or missing Wall Street projections for the period. The day after CrowdStrike reported results for the record quarter, its shares rose by 10%. Jeremy Fielding, a spokesperson representing CrowdStrike, dismissed employees' concerns as baseless and the order's timing is insignificant. The firm stated they closed deals throughout the quarter, starting the first day and often throughout the last day. CrowdStrike also made other statements to further cement that this was all above board, but outsiders have suggested this is eyebrow-raising. And frankly, what Bloomberg has put together does raise an awful lot of questions. Recently, The Verge reported that OpenAI is planning to launch Orion, its next big frontier model, by December. Initially, the new model will not be available via ChatGPT. Instead, it will only be available by the API for select developers. The report went on to add that Microsoft is already preparing to host Orion on Azure as early as November. It even mentioned that OpenAI researchers held a happy hour in September to celebrate the completion of the new model's training. While all this sounds promising, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has slammed the entire report as fake news. Of course, being a good sales and marketing man, he also used the opportunity to then tease major advancements will be coming, just denied the specifics of the report. This week also saw much chatter about Microsoft and OpenAI's partnership being in jeopardy by way of their agreement and some of the language within it. It has been reported that OpenAI and Microsoft's partnership can potentially be terminated if OpenAI achieves artificial general intelligence. And rather remarkably, it has been reported that OpenAI can decide when that goal has been achieved, with them suggesting it could be an iterative development, leaving some to question the investment by Microsoft to this point. It seems odd that they have invested billions and could ultimately have nothing to show for it at the end of things at OpenAI's beck and call. OpenAI could have some sort of advancement that's not really artificial general intelligence at all, but if they say it is, then that could potentially terminate a partnership. And this was reported by multiple media outlets, including the New York Times. But now this episode, scripts, tricks, and tips. The only tip for this week is to check out the social media platform BlueSky. I've been on it for a few months now, and it's kind of been a slow trickle of IT pros joining the platform. But for some reason, in the last week or so, there's been a sudden surge in the number of IT professionals joining. So if you used Twitter in years past before the more recent changes over the last couple of years, and you'd like to get back to a platform like that, I suggest you check out BlueSky. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening.